Hey guys, I've got a pretty neat story I found. I live in Japan studying Japanese and decided I wanted to give older Japanese a go. It's pretty different from modern Japanese, so it was hard, but there's actually plenty of text to practice with. Anyway, my Japanese buddy has an uncle that works at a temple, and said uncle came across an old journal. The journal is really long, so I only translated some interesting bits I found. You'll have to tell me what you think. It is late at night and my wife sits on her knees, sipping from an empty teacup before placing it back on the table. Over and over again she repeats this, her eyes empty and her gaze aimless. I sit across from her, my head on my knee, lying against the wall. I pick at a stray straw on the tatami, counting the moments. Will it come tonight? 3 times in 7 days. The priest at the temple told us it would last until the new moon and come on random days, determined by the whims of a mind no one knew. Sip, clink. Sip, clink. Sip. I finally notice my young wife in her empty teacup. I stand and cross the room, briefly resting a hand on her shoulder as I pass her. With kettle in hand, I take her cup from her. She resists at first, before her eyes fall into focus on my face. She scrunches it, ready to cry. Knock, knock. It's here. She and I freeze, our eyes locked. I break the connection first, facing the door just as the second set of knocks arrive. Knock, knock. Slow, firm, meticulously spaced. The sound of a guest of some renown. Who is it? I ask. It's not a question. Please, sir, I'm so very cold. Won't you please let me in? The voice is small, innocent. The voice of a child or a young woman. It shakes and shivers, and for the 4th time, I consider letting it in. No, I say, you may not enter this house. There is a pause. The knocking begins again. Knock. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks increase in frequency, they increase in speed, they increase in urgency. Please, the voice at our door says, begging, please let me in. My wife is quietly crying beside me as I hold the kettle in one hand and her teacup in the other. No, you are not welcome here, I say. The knocking stops. Silence. A pure silence. The kind which cuts at you, tells you that you are alone even when you know you aren't. Then banging, hard frantic banging, desperate and animalistic, the pounding of 100 tiny hands, the clawing and scaping of beasts too big to be real, too big to imagine even in nightmares. The voice is back. It is the same voice, but wholly different. Let me in. It is full of malice and anger. No, I say. My voice is growing thin. You cannot enter. I almost choke on the words. My mouth is full of water. Let me in, it screams, alone. And then, let me in. There are more voices now, deep and shrill, soft and great, damp and dying and dead. My wife is shaking. Her arms are around my leg as she sobs silently. You... Panic. I cannot say it. I need to say it, but I cannot. I swallow and my next word is meek. You are not welcome here. The pounding ceases. You are not welcome here, I say, my voice returning. Leave, now. Silence. We let the silence sit. I pour my wife tea and sit beside her. We spent the rest of the night with our shoulders pressed against one another, never speaking, never looking at each other, just listening. This has been our life since the night following the previous new moon. Every night we stay awake until dawn, listening for any signs of a visitor, ready to answer it. The first night was pure luck. I was drunk and my wife was sleeping, so I didn't want to open the door to a neighborhood kid. The voice wouldn't answer any of my questions and once the banging started, I began screaming, go away, until it stopped. The next morning, exhausted, my wife and I went to the temple to consult with the priests. The monk that met us was surprisingly knowledgeable and assured us that we were safe as long as we told the visitor firmly that it is not welcome in our home. They cannot enter without permission, he said, his shaved head reflecting sunlight so intensely that I couldn't properly make out his face. Who are they? I asked. He simply shook his head. You are the third family who has come to me. We formed a town guard, a mix of former soldiers and priests, but we've yet to see them. The last family swore they could hear the voices even as we stood outside their front door, with nothing but the summer air before us. With a few last prayers together and a hint or two at the need for donations, my wife and I left the temple. The young monk sent us off, his head a beacon even in the fading afternoon light. It is the 26th night. The moon is beginning to fade in the night sky. My wife says it's the most beautiful thing she has ever seen, the rabbit on the moon smiling upon us. To me, it looks like a mocking smile, a knowing smile. The full moon came and went 11 nights ago. We were told it would be the worst night, and it was, but we made it. Since then, the visits are less frequent and less insistent that they do come. It seems as though the number of voices has dwindled as well. Perhaps they grow impatient and seek other families to bother. I tidy up the bedroom, shoving the futon into our closet while my wife prepares tea in the living room. We have taken to sleeping during the day after I finish my work. It is a short sleep, but it is enough for us now. Our trial is almost over. I leave the bedroom and walk to the living. I stretch my arms over my head and yawn loudly, closing my eyes. When they open, they stop my heart. At our low table, knees resting on a floor cushion, is a well-dressed old man. He wears a white and yellow checkered Haori coat over a black kimono. In his hands is my wife's teacup. I turn to my wife, who is standing, our guest teacup in one hand, clacking against the plate she holds in the other. She is trembling. Who is this? I ask. She merely looks at me and begins to cry. I turn to the old man himself. He is very old and impossibly small. His head seems a normal size, but his torso is that of a much smaller man. His limbs are short as well, and he has no hair but a small pointed beard. Who are you? I ask him. He perks up and looks at me with small eyes. They brighten, showing a look of knowing and remembrance, like a grandfather seeing his grandson for the first time in many years. Oh, yes, welcome, he says. He gestures to the seat before me. Please, take a seat. He turns to my wife. A cup of tea for him as well, if you please. His voice is normal, jovial, the voice of an everyday old man. I begin to feel relaxed. I take a seat across from him, and the house begins to feel strange. Was the table always this low? Was the tatami this frayed before? The color of the walls seem unfamiliar. My wife returns and serves me tea. The old man continues to sip his, and I raise my teacup as well. My wife puts a hand over it. I look at her, and she shakes her head, her eyes wide and terrified. What is it, honey? I ask her. Oh, the tea is fresh and must be scalding hot, says the old man. Do be careful. I will, thank you. My wife sits beside me, staring at the table. I am suddenly aware of the time and the impending moment. I am worried that it will scare the old man. As I ponder, I take a sip of my tea. It is indeed hot. My wife gasps and I turn to her. My eyes pass over the old man as I do, and I see his smile. It is a mocking smile, a knowing smile. The knocking begins. It is small, the smallest it has been before tonight. As the moon weakens, so does the force of these knocks. They no longer seem firm or meticulous. They finally match the voice on the other side of them in size, and timidity. I am flooded with a sense of satisfaction and confidence. I open my mouth to begin the ritual, but the old man speaks first. "Who is it?" he says. It isn't a question. "Please, sir, I am so very cold. Won't you please let me in?" The voice is smaller than ever, barely a whisper, the gasp of a child left to die in the snow. It is easy to muster my strength, my courage to order them away tonight. Tonight, I will deny them so completely that they will never return. I open my mouth and say that you are not welcome here. Leave immediately and never return. But no sound comes out. The old man sips his tea. He places it on the table. He turns his head to the door and says, "Why, yes, of course. Do come in." I turn to my wife, and she is staring at the doorway. Her eyes are wide with terror, and there is a reflection of a moving shadow in them. She screams. The old man is smiling. He is nodding his head, as if greeting an old friend. I turn to the doorway, and that is all I remember. I awoke this morning in the temple. I am told that my wife is gone. I am told that my home has been destroyed, torn asunder like a raft in a typhoon. But I look at them and tell them, "My house? No, that was the old man's house. I will become a monk. I will shave my head, and I hope that it will be as bright and as smooth as the monk I met before. Perhaps I can be a beacon then, who can lead to the light the next family that hears a knocking on their door. This journal will help me in that. I do so miss my wife." And that's it. What do you guys think? A journal or a fiction novel? How was my translation? Edit. So, while I, and apparently the mods of No Sleep, was leaning towards this just being a work of amateur fiction, I've since learned new details about the journal in question that makes me wonder if it isn't true. Apparently, my buddy's uncle didn't actually read through many of the journals he gave me. But my friend mentioned the story of the random night knocking that went off and on for a month. Apparently, he went completely pale. A few years ago, he experienced the same thing, except it happened to the door in his room. The first time he heard it, he was apparently indisposed, and so he asked them to leave and come back in the morning. When he asked around the temple, none of the monks would say it was them that knocked. It continued on and off for the month, but he never found a culprit. When I asked him why he didn't open the door at any point, he said that it was because he just felt like he shouldn't. Anyway, since then, he's given me more journals to look through. I found another entry from a completely different monk that not only references the monk in the story above, but also seems to detail real events. I'll post it soon. I'm starting to really think that this is all real, guys, which is cool, but what if it's putting me in danger? My friend's uncle certainly seems to think he's at risk. Should I keep going? Or should I leave well enough alone? This is the second part of the story. This story uses a slightly more recent but still outdated vernacular. It's quite weird, but seems to at least be based on true events. I joined the temple at a young age, as an orphan. Life is pretty good here, and the older monks are kind and usually very patient, although at times even they get angry. As a kid, I always found this funny rather than scary. Their bald heads would redden, and I would feel like I was facing down an angry tomato or an apple that had fallen on the wrong side of the tree. Honestly, few things scared me, then as well as now. Because as a child, I'd already experienced a fear far greater than anything a beet red monk head could inspire. This temple is famously a little strange. Almost all of the monks are trained for exorcisms, although belief in bad spirits and yokai is at an all-time low both within the temple and outside of it. The residents are also all known for being victims of tragedy, though none of us will never talk about it. I had never intended to write a journal or put down on paper what I saw that night, but a meeting with one of our most peculiar monks changed my mind. He was rather quiet and had been with the temple for a very long time. There were rumors that he was once married, although those rumors left the fate of said marriage open to the imagination. When he did speak, it was usually to chastise the younger monks for not keeping their heads clean-shaven enough. He was the only one who ever seemed to really care about this, going on about how we must be a beacon for those troubled souls who came to our temple, whatever that means. One night, after we had closed for the day, I began our evening cleaning. I was in charge of the temple entrance, but an argument with Mother Nature left me stuck in the bathroom for most of the cleaning time. I rushed to the entrance to complete my duties after the sun had already set. To my dismay, I found the peculiar elder monk there, already cleaning. I apologized profusely and gave my excuses. "It's all right," he said. "Everyone gets a sick stomach sometimes, especially when their head isn't properly shaved." He offered to help me clean so I could get to dinner as soon as possible, and I had a hard time refusing. While we were working, I suddenly realized that he had stopped moving. I turned to face him and saw him staring at the temple doorway. "Elder?" I said. He continued to stare a bit longer, and then, without turning toward me, he asked, "Boy, do you hear knocking?" My skin got a bit clammy, despite the warm early summer air, and I looked at him, hoping to find a sign of humor on his face. He looked dead serious. "No, sir, I don't hear anything," I said. He sighed and loosened his shoulders. His face relaxed. He seemed relieved. We continued sweeping in silence. As we were finishing up, he spoke to me once more. "Boy, I've heard your story from the head monk," he said. I realized he was looking at me. He continued, "I'd like you to write it down." "Sir?" I said. "Write down the story of how you came to be at this temple, and please write down any other strange experiences you've had since then." And so I write. I cannot bring myself to turn down a direct request from an elder monk. And to be honest, the life of a temple monk is pretty dull anyway, so I don't really have anything better to do. Without further ado, please turn the page for my story. Hopefully, you'll find it entertaining. I sure didn't. When I was a boy, my father killed my mother. It wasn't on purpose, nor was it an act of domestic violence gone too far. There was alcohol involved, but no anger. Just an accident. The three of us were hiking the nearby mountain, intending to visit an old, tiny shrine and offer prayers. I learned later that the kami of the shrine was famous for fertility. It seems my parents wanted a second child, but were having little success. We had been climbing for a few hours by then. I remember it was late spring, and the sun was unusually intense for the season. It was at peak heat, and my mother and father were looking over the cliffside, drinking sake together and pointing out things in the distance. I was in the shade of a tree on the opposite side of the path, massaging my toes. My gaita had been chafing the space between my big toe and second toe, and it was getting really hard to walk. I was 8. My father started laughing hard, and I perked up, wanting to be in on the fun. My mother was stifling a giggle and looking proud of herself, so I knew she'd told one of her rare zingers. I always enjoyed her jokes. "What is it, Mom? What'd you say?" I asked, grimacing as I stepped forward, my gaita digging into my blister. She turned toward me and raised a hand as if to say, "Let your father calm down first." But just then, he slapped her back. It was a normal, innocuous gesture, something he'd done so many times before to friends, to me, to my mother, to his own mother. I had always considered it the ultimate compliment, an acknowledgement that my father had found your joke so funny he couldn't even get a word out. This time, my mother wasn't expecting it though. Her face went a bit blank, a show of mild surprise, and then she fell forward. My father noticed, but he noticed too late. His hands reached out for her, but only grabbed air. Life was very different after that. my father went from being a jovial man with a firm stance on anything and everything to a quiet, timid fellow. He attempted to raise me alone, but he was never really able to discipline me after that. I wouldn't bring up that day, but whenever he'd look me in the eyes to scold me, he would suddenly falter and look to the ground with a meek, "Don't do it again." So of course, I would always do it again. The townsfolk talked, of course, saying he murdered my mother. They talked less when, after a few years passed, he never even attempted to remarry. I was 12 when the next actor came into play. I grabbed an apple off a fruit vendor cart and ran, dodging through alleyways and underskirts in an attempt to avoid my pursuer. It wasn't until later that I learned people had given up trying to chase me down. They usually just went straight to my father, and he would pay them for whatever I stole, plus a little extra. This day, however, I was still ignorant of this. Breathless, I collided with a man who I still to this day swear had not been there a moment before. I went tumbling into the dirt and coughed a bit as some of it tickled my throat. The man held out a hand, and I refused it, getting up on my own. "Watch where you're going, old man," I said. The man was not old, but I was not a polite boy. He was quite young-looking, in fact, with a smooth face. His beard stubble was oddly ash-colored in places, which made it hard to date him exactly, but I imagine he was about 30 and was just graying early. "Forgive me," he said. "I wasn't paying attention." He wiped off his pant leg. The dirt was a different color from the road. A suit gray. He was wearing a Western suit which was rather rare in my town. I scoffed at him and began to leave, confident that I'd shaken my pursuers. But the man cut me off and suddenly squatted down, so his eyes were just a bit below mine. This was when I realized that he was somewhat unnaturally tall. "Would you like to see your mother again?" he said. I was a bit shocked, of course. It was common knowledge that my mother had died, but no one had ever talked to me about it before. In my shock, I did the only thing I knew to do. I scowled. I turned away from him and walked off without saying anything. I remember looking back to find him watching me. He tipped his hat. I ran. My 13th birthday was not a happy birthday. My father bought me a gift, but I didn't open it. Instead, we fought. I had struck my tutor the day before while he taught me calligraphy. He kept making me rewrite a certain character over and over and over again. It was a character I had learned a long time before, but he was adamant that I had learned it wrong and wanted to fix the way I wrote it. The word was beautiful scent. It was also my mother's name. That day, my father had somehow found his voice. He finally confronted me on everything I'd been stealing, breaking, hurting. "It's time for you to grow up. It's time for you to move on. It's time for you to let your anger go," he said. "I'll never let it go. I'll never forgive you for what you did." I can still remember how those words felt in my throat, how they scraped and scratched and burned on the way out. My father's face burned too. Its fire turned from anger to shame. It burned and burned until tears came out. I raged. "How dare he cry? How dare he cry?" I began throwing things, shouting, punching, kicking, screaming, crying, ripping out my hair. My father moved forward, his arms outstretched, the fire on his face threatening to swallow me, and so I ran. I ran with everything I had. With every pore of my being I ran. I ran straight for the mountain, that glaring blemish on our town that neither I nor my father had ever returned to. Until now. I hadn't been there in 6 years. There wasn't any distinct landmark to place it, but I knew exactly where it was. It was seared into my memory, this view, so beautiful, so vast. A sea of trees that spread breathlessly before me before being engulfed by the orange sky. In the sunset, I saw fire. The same fire that had scorched my throat and burned my father's face. The same fire that had consumed my mother as she fell into the oceans of trees below. Behind me, there was a footstep. I turned, wheezing, tears streaming down my face. It was the man in the Western suit. "Leave me alone," I said. He just stared over my shoulder at the sunset. Its reflection danced in his eyes. I began to step forward, the anger rising ever higher. "Leave." The man looked at me, long and hard. His beard was half ash, and his eyes seared into me. He stepped toward me, softly but firmly. Once again, he asked, "Would you like to see your mother?" I just stared. I felt such anger, but it began to fade, replaced with something else, something as furious and impossible to contain as the fire it replaced. I fell to my knees crying, "Yes, yes, I wanted to see my mother. Of course I want to see her. There's nothing I want more." The man squatted down before me. He seemed smaller this time. "I'd like to see my mother again too," he said, "but my father killed her." I looked at him and met his eyes. I began to feel an odd twang of fear. "I know your feelings," the man went on. "I know your anger, how it burns." I sat there, panting, the fear bubbling up in my chest. I pushed it down and asked, "Was it an accident?" The man looked at me long and hard. "What do you think?" I was walking back to my home. There were no tears in my eyes, only anger, only fire. My father wasn't home when I arrived, and so I sat down at the table and waited. When he finally returned home, he was crying. He walked forward, apologizing, saying he was so sure he'd lost me too. "You didn't lose her," I said. My voice was ice, despite the flames bubbling to the top. "You killed her." He stopped in the living room. His smile cracked, then broke. "Yes," he said. We sat in silence. My chest was burning. "That's all I needed to hear," I said, and I stood. He looked up at me, a glimmer of hope in his eye. I walked toward him, and he began to stretch out his arms. He wanted to embrace me, and I knew it. I walked by him without looking at him. My face was full of anger, pure fire. 4 days later, I returned home. I had cooled down, and I knew I had nowhere better to go. I cannot say that at this moment I was ready to forgive him, but I couldn't stay mad at my father for too long. He was still my father, and I knew even then that he was trying his best. My house was on fire. The town firemen were there in their thick jackets looking gruff. None of them were going inside. "Is anyone in there?" I asked one. He regarded me roughly out of the corner of his eye, then humphed. "There's an old guy," he said, "but I'm not about to go risking my life for some bastard who killed his own wife." I threw a bucket of water over my head and rushed in. The shouts of the onlookers and firemen faded into the roars of the flame as they enclosed around me. I passed through the kitchen and the hall, opening the door to my father's room. The fire was everywhere, choking me. The room was empty, still untouched by flame. I moved further down the hall to my own room, but the smoke was thick. The fire was stealing my breath. I collapsed, gasping as I opened the door to my room. There was my father. He was hugging my pillow and crying. "Father!" I shouted. He did not hear me. "Father, we need to leave." I started to enter the room. Something moved to my right. I turned. The man in the Western suit. He stood tall, completely unfazed by the flame around him, his suit and ash-dotted beard pristine. He turned his eyes from my father to me. Suddenly, I could breathe again. I stood up. "Help me save him," I said. "Please." The man stared at me. He seemed big again, and yet our eyes were level. "No," he said. His voice was monotone and passionless. I pushed him and went to my father. I threw him onto my back, but he was unresponsive. He must have passed out since I entered the room. I left and hurried down the hallway. The heat was no longer affecting me, and the smoke felt cool and soothing to my lungs. I had strength unlike anything I've ever felt before or since. As I arrived in the living room, I found him yet again. The man stood before the door, his suit still flawless and untouched. "Move," I said. The man just looked at me, his expression blank. "Drop him, and I shall," he said. "He is my father," I said. "Drop him." "I can't. He's my father." The flames suddenly grew quiet. They began to shrink, not in size but in height, almost as if they were bowing. "Do not speak to me of fathers, boy," the man said. Preposterously, the room grew cold. "Fathers," he said, his monotone dripping with venom. "Murderers, scum. They think nothing of snuffing out their own flesh and blood." The fires were still low but grew in intensity. "Fathers," he said, his voice passionless no more, seemingly coming from all around me as though the flames were echoing him. "He who threw away his firstborn son and wife, he who now lives in peace with stolen children." "Father!" he shouted. The flames drew close, kissing my back, drawing a clear path between me and the door, with the man still before it. "All of his children will be ashes," he screamed, "and this world with them." I stood in silence, breathing heavily. My body was chilled, but I still possessed that mysterious strength from earlier. The man stood before me, a path of flames between us. His eyes were large and wide. "Move," I said again. "Drop him, and I shall let you go." The monotone voice returned, as passionless as before, but his face was still engulfed in rage. He stepped aside. I hoisted my father further up on my back and pushed forward. The man in the western suit sighed and shook his head. All at once, the air was once again aflame. I choked and floundered for my breath. My body went weak and limp, and I fell as the man said, "Then burn," before he himself was engulfed by the flames. I struggled to rise, but my father was so heavy. My muscles would not heed me, and my lungs begged for air, but I still pushed, reaching for the door just a few inches before me. I blacked out. When I awoke, mere seconds later, I was being carried. The fire was still around me, but the door was growing closer. I looked up. A black, charred skull rained ash upon me, holding me like a babe. He looked down at me, one human eye remaining, and he whispered, "Everything will be okay." When I awoke, I was in this very temple. The monks told me my survival was a miracle. When I asked how I lived, they said they found me before my doorway, passed out. The firemen assumed I had fainted from the smoke after simply opening the door. They made snide remarks like, "Thank God you're such a wimp, or you might have died." Many years later, I sit here, writing. Just a few hours prior, I returned from a rare trip to the onsen. Our town has a famous natural spring, and we welcome every new monk that comes to the temple by enjoying a bath at it. The new monk gasped when he saw my back. "Such a nasty burn," he said. I laughed and nodded. "And such a strange shape," he continued. "It almost looks like a human hugging you from behind." The other monks turned their heads, uncomfortable. They had each said the same thing when they first saw my back. I looked at the new boy and began to give him the usual spiel about how I had a burning effigy fall on my back and how the temple had healed me, so I decided to serve here as thanks. Instead, I said something different. I said, "By the way, if you ever have any weird stories or incidents, you should write them down. It's sort of a tradition in this temple. Also, keep your head shaved." The boy looked at me, a bit confused, but he nodded. I laid back and sighed, enjoying the heat of whatever burned below us, heating this bath. Well, what about this one, guys? Still think it seems like it's the work of an amateur novelist? I did too, until I did a bit of digging. It turns out one of the monks in my friend's uncle's temple acts as a record keeper. He keeps a record of every monk that comes in or out, and he's had countless predecessors. There is indeed a record of a 13-year-old boy picked up in the wake of a fire that killed his father. He was burned when the entryway to his house fell on him, or so the fireman said. The monk swore that he had met with a god in the fire, a mighty kami filled with hate who sought revenge. Of course, no one believed him, but I'm starting to. I think I'll be asking for more journals to translate, by the way. If these stories really are true, then there might be more clues within others. I'm also thinking of taking a trip up to that fertility shrine on top of the mountain. What do you guys think?